The argument for God takes many forms. Today, we're going to look at the argument from design. It's one of the classic arguments about how we infer God from what we see in the world around us. The design argument is one, as I said, of many. There's the cosmological argument, teleological. There's a bunch of different arguments. This is one of the most fun because we can look at stuff, and stuff is interesting. And so what we're going to do today, we actually had a 6-part series on design, and so this draws from some of that and adds some new material. Some of it's going to be kind of fun. Some of it's going to be just a rehash for those of you who've seen it before, but it'll be compressed. So there is so much material that I could talk about that I'm going to gloss over a lot of stuff. So you have a handout, and you will not need to take much in the way of notes because you will get, if you attended and signed up or registered, I'll email you a copy of the slides and also the recording. We're recording this, and we'll send that out once the recording is processed and finished as well. So you'll get all that. So you don't have to worry about writing down too much stuff. There's going to be a whole lot of Bible verses that we will gloss over just to get the big idea out of it. So we're not going to, I don't want you to be too distracted with taking notes. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to start with a timeline because this argument goes way back. We sometimes think it started with Darwin. It actually started centuries, actually millennia before that. So we'll cover that very briefly. And I want to give you a brief overview of the timeline. So we'll do world history in about 2 minutes and cover the design argument as it has been shown. There's a critical point in that timeline, and that's Paley's watch. And some of you have heard of that. We'll cover what that argument was and then kind of show where you are on that timeline. Then we're going to go into some scriptural claims. We'll talk about what the scripture says about God as the designer and what it shows about his designed product. And we'll look at that as well. And then the bulk of our time will be spent on the scientific claims. And we're going to go through 5 different areas. We'll talk about a book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, which actually documents stuff that was happening in the early 20th century. And then we'll cover irreducible complexity, these other topics. Engineering and systems design is a brand new argument in the last couple of years. We'll do optimum design and biomimicry, where scientists are mimicking biological design to get optimal design for us to work with robotics and all kinds of things today. And then we'll cover a little bit of astronomy. And again, that's a brief outtake from what we've covered earlier. And I'll give you links to all the earlier talks that are on video if you're interested in that later. So let's focus for just a minute or two on the timeline. Again, this is going to be really fast. You're going to be kind of sprinting. So we're going to talk about the intelligent design, or ID, evolutionary timeline. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of divide things up, and the ID evolutionary timeline will be the concept in blue and the data in green. This will make more sense later, and especially if you're in the back, you're not going to be able to see this once I get the timeline built because it's going to be too small. But I just want you to get the picture of what's happening with the arguments more than the detail. So the timeline will be in yellow, and we'll kind of do it like this. So the evolutionary timeline for intelligent design, the design world will be on the top. The methodological naturalism or the materialism world will be on the bottom. Okay, and those will be in pink and orange. So as we build our timeline, we have to start with God said in the beginning that he created. And that goes back to, as far as we can tell, Moses writing the Pentateuch, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So at least 1500 BC, we're pretty confident. We have good archaeological evidence that that was written by that point. So that claim is made very early. But we typically think about the Greeks, and they come along at about the 5th century BC, and they have ideas about the general way in which animals change over time in small ways. And so we see Lucretius and this natural selection precursors actually several centuries before Christ. So it goes way, way back. But then we have Paul in the mid-1st century, as he writes in the book of Romans, that God's design is evident in what he made, that God himself is shown by what he made. So that's the 1st century. As we go fast forward, we can see an interesting thing happen. They forgot about the Greeks for about 1,000 years. But they get rediscovered in about 1100 AD. The Arab translators discovered these guys, and the Western academics loved it. And there's a group called the Scholastics, that whole period in the early second millennium, 11 to 1200 AD. You get this group called the Scholastics. You may have heard of those, or maybe not. But it's when the Western philosophers rediscovered the Greek philosophers and decided they're so old, they must have been closer to creation, they must have had all the answers. And so a lot of the ideas from the Greek philosophers at that point became sort of incorporated with and mixed with Christianity. That was some good and some bad, because they had some good ideas, but not everything. So what happens about 3 centuries later, we start getting Bible translation. So we have Luther, we have Wycliffe in the 1200s. Of course, Luther is the late 1500s, early 1600s. And as the Bible is translated, it begins to expand people's understanding of our relationship with God, and it also expands their willingness to think about the physical world and what the implications are. And so we start seeing a lot of different things, both in philosophy and science and in art. And so we have the Renaissance following very shortly, and I think the translation of the Bible into vernacular languages was a big part of the Renaissance, which is largely secular, but also religious acceleration of philosophy and art. And then after that, we also have the Reformation right in that same time period. And we have the scientific revolution. So all these things are happening right after the Bible starts being available to more people in their own language. So a huge input. But we also have, on the other side, we have this thing called the Enlightenment. Probably one of the worst named periods ever. It was really the Endarkenment, because what they did in the Enlightenment was they took all of the ancient ideas and they said, we're going to ignore those and start from scratch. And so they used pure philosophy, for the most part, to derive ideas that in many cases were contrary to the Bible and probably contrary to truth as far as Christianity is concerned. So the Enlightenment is kind of a downer. It's kind of the anti-response to the biblical translation and people becoming more familiar with the word. So after the Enlightenment gets up and running, in this whole period, we see a bunch of science happening. So we have William of Ockham with Occam's razor. We have Roger Bacon's scientific method. We have Copernicus and Galileo with astronomy. We have Isaac Newton with gravitation. We have Bray and Kepler with laws of planetary motion. We have, this one is Descartes with philosophy and consciousness. He could almost go either way, on the top or the bottom, but he claimed to be a Christian, so we'll put him up there. And then we have William Paley and his watch analogy. On the other side, out of the Enlightenment, we get these guys. David Hume, a classical radical skeptic, claimed to be a Christian priest, a Roman Catholic priest, but he basically found ways to undermine and disbelieve every possible claim. So he was a radical skeptic. And then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I won't go into him. He's a real bad story in terms of philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche and Bertrand Russell. So these guys are up into the early 20th century, falling out of the Enlightenment with these bad philosophical ideas. And they basically reject the design argument. And they say that things have the appearance of design, but they're not really designed. And that carries us into the modern period of materialism, where science only looks at causes that are material in nature. But let's look at William Paley and what his argument was. Now, he lived until the early 1800s. He died about 1805. About 1802, he makes this incredibly helpful analogy. And he says, suppose he's crossing the heath, because he was British, and he crosses heaths, he doesn't cross a meadow. So he was crossing heath, and he pitched his foot against a stone, and he was asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew, to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this claim. In other words, it's been there a long time, don't know, it's been a long time, okay? But suppose, on the other hand, in this same place, he came across a watch that was partially buried, and he dug that up. Suppose I found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had given before, that for anything I knew, the watch might have been there forever. There must have existed at some point someone who made this watch for a purpose. And so this example, Paley's watch, is a classical design argument that's been referred to, and it's never really been refuted. Now, people have answered the claim, and they've said, well, it could have happened this way. Somebody answering a claim with a counterclaim without evidence, a claim is not evidence. A claim is simply a just-so story that needs evidence before it can be taken seriously. But that's not the way our world takes it today. Anyway, that's Paley's watch, a very important argument in the history of these conflicting ideas. As we move forward from that point, In the, again, early 1800s, we have Erasmus Darwin, who was the grandfather of Charles Darwin, came up with almost everything that Charles did, but he wasn't a very good writer. Charles comes along, he's a good writer and a good marketer, and so his ideas become more popular with his Origin of Species. We also have, I'm out of sequence there, but we also had Charles Lyell and a man named Hutton, who came up with the idea of old geology, which gave Darwin's theory allegedly time in which to occur. So we have those things going on. But on the other side, we have this guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-discoverer of the theory of natural selection. He breaks with Darwin because he says, you know, you and I came up with the idea at the same time of natural selection and random mutation and so on, but I don't think that can explain consciousness and the difference between apes and humans. Those were his two big things. And so he broke with Darwin over those things, and they actually had quite a falling out. And so Alfred Russel Wallace becomes kind of a spiritist, kind of a deist. He's into the occult, but he's into the spiritual realm, saying that natural selection is not adequate to explain what we see. So I'll put him on the theistic side, even though he's not a Christian theist, if you will. But after that, we have Gregor Mendel, who discovers things about genetics. We have World War I coming about this point, so that's the time period wherein a guy named George McCready Price starts giving some scientific evidence. He was an amateur geologist who actually did some pretty good work, but he was discounted because he didn't have professional training in geology. After him, about 30 years later, Henry Morris and John Whitcomb write a classic book called The Genesis Flood. Have any of you read The Genesis Flood? It's a really good, yeah, see, of course Noel's read The Genesis Flood. We go way back together along with Morris probably, but yeah, so it's a classic argument. It's a really well done book. You can read it today. It still makes sense almost, I think it'll be 70 years later, or 60 years later. And it talks about, he was the head of a department of hydrology at a major university. So now we have a well-trained academic who is respected in his field, and he uses evidence of what happens in floods as evidence for the great flood of Noah's Day being worldwide. And he has some very, very convincing arguments that, have not been really refuted. So Mendel and genetics are kind of discounted because they can't figure out what to do with them, but about 1930 to 40, there are these guys that incorporate genetics into natural selection ideas of Darwin, and that is the neo-Darwinian consensus. So if you've ever heard of neo-Darwinianism, that's where they put genetics into the mutation and natural selection idea. And so they kind of co-opt that idea for the naturalist side. Then we have World War II coming in a little bit before Morris, but then after that we start getting a flood of ideas, the first one being Charles Thaxton and Walter Bradley that write a book on the origin of life and just describe how difficult it is for life to have come into being by accident. And then we start getting into the intelligent design movement per se, and that kicks off in about 1996 with a guy named Michael Behe. We'll talk about him a little bit more. But then you have the angry atheists in the early 21st century, so around 2000 to 2005, you get Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, and Harris, these four guys writing books that are basically screaming about how silly Christianity is without offering evidence. So they're very, very good writers. They're British after all. So they write convincing prose, but there's no evidence. So they're tearing down Christianity, but they're not offering anything to replace it. And so they have ideas about vestigial organs, junk DNA, and bad or inefficient designs, but they also have a lot of sarcasm and just those stories about, well, it could have happened this way. That's not evidence. An explanation is not evidence. You actually have to do science to get evidence. But what Dawkins says is biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So he's trying to discount the purpose that we see in biology by ridiculing it, basically. And he says physics, on the contrary, is the study of simple things that do not tempt us to invoke design. So he kind of plays into good rhetoric but bad argumentation. And so what happens after that, in the 2000 plus, is we have a whole flood of authors that I'm not going to go through, providing really solid evidence. These are each books that have been written on individual topics that advance the idea of design. And we'll talk about a couple of them as we go through the scientific evidence. But basically, they refute the idea of vestigial organs, of junk DNA, and also of bad or inefficient design. And so all of the arguments that were raised by the angry atheists and by Darwin by this point have now been refuted. And they've been shown to be ineffective in explaining the design that we see. So what you're left is the sarcasm and just so stories. That's all that's left, because we've taken away all of the evidence. Again, going forward, you start seeing more and more evidence from the design side. And as we look at the whole timeline and put it back into place, again, all of the arguments that were advanced by Darwin have been refuted. And as we kind of explode those with actual evidence, and we look at, again, the big picture, we have to keep reminding ourselves that they don't have evidence on their side, that the original claims that God made in the beginning, God created, that went back to 1,500 years ago, those are still valid. Sorry, 1,500 BC, that's 3,500 years ago. Those are still valid. And we see evidence of those, and you see all the evidence on the top side of the chart showing that. Just in the last couple of years, they've started cataloging the number of papers that have been published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, which is kind of the gold standard. And what you see is literally hundreds of papers now that are being accepted by scientific journals in which people who are supporters of intelligent design make their case without necessarily using the language, but in describing things. So they're being very careful to put scientific evidence into these journal articles and not necessarily call it intelligent design, but if you look at what's happening, that's what it is. And so there's a concerted effort to get peer-reviewed, academic, respectable journals to actually document what God did, although we're not putting it quite in that language, just because it wouldn't be published if you put it in that direct language. So that's the big picture timeline, and the you are here moment is you are over there after all these arguments have been, you're here, you're today. And we have this body of growing evidence that's been documented. So let's move on from the timeline discussion. That's enough history. Let's look at the scriptural claims. And this, again, we're going to go really, really kind of quickly through this, because most of these verses will be very familiar to you. But I just want to give you kind of an overview of some of the many, many places where God has talked about as the designer. So one of the first places, we believe one of the first books written was Job. And when when Job is challenging God, God's answer is not directly why Job is suffering. Instead, God's answer is, where were you when I did all this stuff? Who are you to ask me? Basically, is what he's what he is saying. And he starts describing some of the creatures he made. Some of those are extinct, but one of those is Leviathan, this incredible sea creature that we can imagine, but we've never actually seen one that has all of these characteristics. And then there's one called Behemoth. Now, have you ever wondered how to pronounce Behemoth? I kind of wondered as well, so I asked.
Behemoth. Some pronounce it also more as Behemoth.
Thank you very much. So that's how you pronounce it. It's this incredible creature that was powerful, massive, and God was pointing to it and saying, you didn't make this, you weren't here when I made this, but you know it exists, apparently. So he's describing something that Job would have recognized at that time, and apparently it could have been a dinosaur-like creature. It certainly was not an elephant or a rhinoceros, because some of the characteristics just don't work. So Job is one of those places where we can see God's design argument clearly shown. And then there are many places in Psalms. One of those is Psalm 8, where it says, "O Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. When I consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place," again, making a claim that God did those things. "What is man that you're mindful of him?" And so, again, farther down in the psalm, it talks about different animals that God's created, and, "O Lord, how majestic is your name in the earth." So, again, many, many places in the Psalms where God's creatures are highlighted as evidence that God himself exists. Psalm 39, "You created my innermost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb." And then we have Romans 1, the classic passage I mentioned earlier in the timeline. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So what has been made points to God. So we'll come back to a little bit more of God's design and when we talk about engineering and how God is an engineer. But I want to highlight now some of the early 20th century design evidences. There's a book that came out in 2021 by a man named Stephen Meyer. He's one of the smartest and most humble men you'll ever meet. And he called his book The Return of the God Hypothesis, because he's basically saying because of these three scientific evidences that he's going to cite, these three scientific evidences show that there had to be something non-natural, something immaterial, something supernatural that points to a supernatural entity that had to create them. And so here are those three things that he came up with and cited. The first one is ever since the discovery of the expanding universe, it was realized that the universe had to have had a starting point. Now, the secularists call it the Big Bang. I call it the creation event. I think it was an orderly event. In many places, there are at least 3 or 4 places in Scripture where it says God rolled out the heavens like a garment. He did it in an orderly fashion with a purpose, and he did it with intentionality. And so at the point where you see that happening, let me go just for a minute into how this works. The universe is expanding. We know that. We've also discovered, since Edwin Hubble, he began looking into this, but we know now that the universe is not only expanding, the expansion is accelerating. So you would think that if the universe was expanding and it was cyclic, that the gravity would be dragging it back together at some point, or the expansion would be slowing. But it's expanding and accelerating, and we don't know why. That's where they posit black energy. It's this unknown energy source that we can't define. Some scientists will say it's up to 95% of the Earth, of the universe's matter, has to be black energy to make the universe expand, but we don't know what it is. We can't describe it. We can only describe the behavior of the universe as we are able to detect it. So this expansion and acceleration of expansion proves that the universe had to have had some kind of a starting point. So at the point where time and space and matter all came into being, the space-time continuum, as Einstein talked about, that's the point at which the universe started. And I believe it was an orderly process. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So the origin of the universe is a really big discovery. The second one is the realization that all of the forces in the universe are finely tuned and balanced. If you change them in the least amount of gravitational force, or the speed of light, or electromagnetic forces, the strong and weak force of the atom, if you change any of those by the minutest portion, the whole thing stops working. It requires all of those things working in concert, balanced, in order for the universe to work. You would not be here if the strong and weak force of the atom, the strong force holds the nucleus together, the weak force holds the electrons in place. That allows chemistry, it allows matter, it allows all of the material world that we see, from metallurgy to water. I mean, it's just it's a basic building block, and it's all balanced. So the finely tuned laws of physics. And then we have the information content in the genome, beginning with the discovery of DNA with Watson and Crick at Cambridge University in the 1950s. And then the inference that they were able to confirm later that this DNA is actually a computer code, or a computer-like code, that programs for certain portions of our cellular makeup. I'm not going to go into the details of how that works. That's another talk. But it's a fascinating story about how DNA works, and it is a code. It's a computer code. And the way Meyer describes it, in our uniform and repeated experience, every time we see any of these things, we can infer the source. So for example, with computer programming, anytime we see a coherent code that accomplishes something, there is a coder, a computer programmer, who had to make that happen. We've never seen a computer program spring into its existence on its own. And so every time we see a program, we know there's a programmer. We can infer that. So the inference to the best explanation is that if we see a code in DNA, it also had a coder behind that code. So those three laws are really critical. So what can we take from those three discoveries? Well, so let's look at what the entity had to be like in order to create these things. So if you're creating time, space, and matter, then whoever or whatever created that has to be beyond time or timeless. He has to be without space and matter to create space and matter. Does that make sense? So he has to be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. He also has to be incredibly powerful. Look at the power that's in the nuclear devices, the nuclear reactors that we've been able to work. Think about the power that it takes to make atoms have that much power. So the entity had to be incredibly powerful, innovative, and intelligent to come up with all of those incredible designs. And the entity that did this had to be decisive and to make a personal decision. To be decisive, you have to be personal. You have to be able to think and have a will and a purpose in mind in order to do something that requires a starting point and all this intentionality. So if I was to describe to you some entity that is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, innovative, intelligent, decisive, and personal, what would you call that entity? We would call it God. Okay? Whatever God's nature actually is, which we get a lot of clues in the scripture, but he's still a mystery. We are finite creatures. Would we really want to worship an entity that's understandable? He's not totally. And so we describe this entity as God. And that's a reasonable thing to do. So that's what I would call this entity, and you seem to agree. Okay, so that's the return of the God hypothesis, documenting those 20th century discoveries. Let's move on to irreducible complexity. Those are big words. Don't get scared. What it means is if you reduce the complexity at all, it will no longer work. So a classic example that Michael Behe came up with, he talks about, he was he still is alive, microbiologist at Lehigh University, and we'll talk just briefly about what he discovered, but he uses the analogy of a mousetrap. Now, a mousetrap is a fairly simple device. It has a certain number of parts, and the book that he came up with, that he wrote this about is in 1996, is called Darwin's Black Box. Fascinating idea about the deeper Darwin looked. He thought, the deeper I look, it'll be simple when I get to the next step. All he could see was the blob that was the nucleus. He thought, when I look in there, it'll be simple. Or actually, if you look at the cell to start with, the cell would be simple. Then they got better microscopic techniques. They could see inside the cell, and they saw there's a bunch of stuff going on in there, but there's that blob in the middle called the nucleus. I'm sure that'll be simple when we get to it. And guess what? DNA. So every time we look deeper, we find more complexity, not less. So I came up with this idea of a mousetrap to explain a way in which we can think about it. Now, a mousetrap has several parts. It has a platform, holding bar, hammer, spring, and catch. Fairly simple device. However, if you mess with it, it's not going to work very well. So suppose we take this simple device and we have one of the parts is proportionally too small. If the base was too small, is this going to be able to catch any mice? It's not going to catch less mice. It's not going to be less fit. It's going to be totally inoperative, right? And so the base has to be big enough to hold all these parts, to kind of have some stability and to hold them in place. Similarly, it has to be made out of the right material. So suppose we had it made out of paper mache instead of wood. Would it catch less mice or no mice? No mice, right? Okay, and so if we put all these pieces back in place, it still has to be assembled properly. The parts all have to be properly proportioned, but it also has to be set. Somebody has to put some kind of food in there so that the mouse will be attracted to it. And then we have to account for things going wrong. So here's what happens when you try and set a mousetrap. Don't worry, no mice will be harmed in the setting of this mousetrap. You just don't always know what's going to happen when you set a mousetrap, right? Now, this probably wouldn't happen, but there are all kinds of real-world things that get in the way when we try and have even a simple machine. The point is it all has to work. Let me give you another example. Remember the example of Paley's watch, with finding a watch in the wilderness. Well, suppose we found an even simpler device than a mousetrap or a watch. We had a pocket knife, okay? Now, even a simple pocket knife has lots and lots of parts. So let's get an even simpler pocket knife. It just has one blade, okay? So here's our pocket knife. It works great. You fold it up, you put it in your pocket, you can cut stuff. but it's got a simple design, but it's still not trivial. So there are ways you can mess this design up. Let's suppose that we have a blade that's a little too big for the housing. You can't put it in your pocket now, it loses some of its functionality. So you have to have the parts properly proportioned in order for it to work. But not only properly proportioned, you have to make it out of the right material. So suppose I make it out of wood, the blade's now made out of wood. How well is that gonna work? Any of you guys fishermen want to try and clean your fish with a wooden blade? Or suppose we made it with cork, another problem. So the materials have to be optimized for the tasks. So the shape is right, the material's wrong, it won't work. So lots of variables here. Suppose we have the right blade, you can play this game forever, but we make the handle out of cork. Same problem. Both the parts have to be made out of the right stuff. When designers build things, they have lots of things they have to think about. So among them are the materials, the shape, how to assemble it, and how to have multiple parts that all interact together. But when designers work, they actually have a whole lot of contingencies. There are many, many things that they have to take into consideration, not the least of which at the end and on the bottom there is manufacturing concerns about environmental impact, where you source the stuff, fair trade practices, import and export considerations, tariffs, all those kinds of things. In order to make a profit, you have to make a profit in order to make something so you can keep making it, otherwise you go out of business. So there's all these design considerations. Similarly in biology, we'll look at some similar ideas where in biology we have to have some of these similar ideas of trade-offs and optimization. What Michael Behe did in that book, Darwin's Black Box, is he highlighted a specific function called the bacterial flagellum. So this short video is going to talk about the bacterial flagellum and help you understand how complex things, much more complex than a watch, and especially when you think about it being self-assembled, self-manufactured, self-reproducing, self-repairing.
In Darwin's Black Box in 1996, Behe spotlighted and made famous a number of really interesting discoveries that had been occurring in biochemistry and cell biology over the last 2 or 3 decades. And what biologists, molecular biologists, cell biologists, microbiologists have been discovering is that at the level of individual cells, there are little tiny examples of nanotechnology, little tiny machines at work. The flagellar motor is the one that Behe made most famous. It's a rotary engine that powers a whip-like tail, a protein tail that functions like a propeller, and it moves the bacterium through liquid, enabling the bacterium to essentially track down its food supply. And this little machine includes a rotor, a stator, a drive shaft, a U-joint, first direction on a quarter of a turn, and turn 100,000 RPM in the other direction.
Bacterial flagellum is a true nanomachine, about 40 nanometers in size. It's amazing. I mean, E. coli, salmonella, which are kind of our model systems for the bacterial flagellum, can propel a cell about 20 lengths per second through a very viscous medium, like water to these organisms. And you extrapolate that to human scale. 20 body lengths per second, 6-foot person, times 20, 120 feet per second. Mark Spitz or Phelps would be setting records with this type of propulsion.
It's hardwired into a signal transduction circuit that allows the bacterium to sense changes in the sugar gradient in the surrounding liquid.
This signal transduction system is actually a short-term memory system where the cell is, if it's going in the direction of an attractant, a nutrient that it can use to metabolize, it follows that chemical gradient. If it's a repellent, it will sense that and move in the opposite direction. So it's more than just this engine.
It's an extraordinary piece of nanotechnology. It's high-tech in low life. And so just by spotlighting these extraordinary pieces of nanotechnology inside cells, and the flagellar motor wasn't the only one by any means, Behe, in a sense, opened up a window for people. He opened up the black box of the inner workings of the cell and said, look, this is much more complex than anything that than anything that the early evolutionary biologists had envisioned. Darwin knew nothing of this type of nanotechnology in cells, and at the very least, we've got to come up with an explanation for this.
So as you can see, it's much more complex than the simple machines, even the watch that we were looking at. Again, because it self-assembles, it's programmed from DNA. This is a series of multiple proteins, which are little cellular machines that are made to do specific functions. So let's move on from irreducible complexity and go to the engineering systems design argument. This is kind of a new thing. There's a book that came out recently called Your Designed Body. It was about 2023, and it was by a systems engineer and a medical doctor. So the medical doctor it documents in this book some of the many complex things that have to happen for us to remain alive. He's a hospice doctor, so he knows all the ways you can become dead. And he prolongs life. He does a very good job of that, but he can't do everything. So he realizes there are many things that can make us dead. The systems engineer looks at these things and says, if I was going to design this, what kind of steps would be involved? And so the combination of these two guys is brilliant. It's a really well-written book. It's one that's accessible. You would not need to be a medical doctor or engineer to get the point. So let's talk about their argument briefly. So engineers know certain things. They know that systems require many parts. And we won't go into the blue details, but that'll be available for you later. They have to be coherent. All these parts have to work together. They have to be manufacturable and manufactured properly, assembled properly. Systems of systems usually exhibit complex interdependencies. So not only do you have to have a system that works, it is interdependent with other systems. So that's some of the things engineers think about. Physicians, on the other hand, take this into biology, and they know that the body has to follow rules. It has to be chemically balanced. You have to have a certain amount of salinity, but salt likes to go across barriers in certain directions, and in order to keep the salinity proper, you have to have mechanisms that do those things, for example. You also have the body must be able to take control of those processes, and when they're out of balance, it has to be able to take action to correct them. The body has to possess exactly the right functional capacities in order to do what the body is supposed to do. In other words, just having a body there that can't move its arms or can't speak, can't do anything, it has to have functional capabilities that are built into these systems. And then the body has to be finely tuned, much as we saw with the different forces of nature. The body has to be finely tuned so that it can do all the things it's supposed to do. And it turns out that engineering was God's idea. And so we look at some of the ways that we see God as the designer. Again, I'll just highlight these and you'll have them in your notes later. But he's the author of life from Genesis 2:7. He created all of life. He is the engineer and he's an architect. So he knows how to build things. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he uses these housing and engineering analogies. Every house is built by someone, but the builder of everything is God. So we see these engineering principles, and we go on and on. He is an intentional designer. He is also purposeful and efficient. He is beyond that. He is the provider of all the things we need to make the things that we make and the things that he made. He had to make all of the raw materials for those things. So he provided raw materials. We see this as early as Genesis 2, talking about different materials that were made available for people to use to build things. He uses building analogies throughout the scriptures, and here's an example in 1 Corinthians 3:10. According to the grace God's given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder and someone else is building on. So this idea of engineering even plays into spiritual development. But he also teaches engineering. He builds cities, he does shipbuilding. He taught Noah apparently how to build an ark that seems to have worked pretty well. King Solomon built a temple. He even allows people to misuse his creation and use it for evil. And the idea, again, back to Genesis 4, we have metallurgy coming up as early as Genesis 4. So very, very early in man's development. Have you ever thought about this? Any of you ever been to a mine where they do, we went to a copper mine years ago. And in this copper mine, they would extract the ore, and it's about 1% to 2% copper. So they have to grind it, they have to chemically treat it, they have to heat it. Who would think of taking a rock, grinding it down to powder, then trying to filter it, heat it, and make metal out of it? If you ever came across a rock in the wilderness, would you think of doing that on your own? I think this was something God inspired and taught men how to do very, very early. And again, we see it in the very early Genesis accounts. So that's what God does as an engineer. Let's talk about what is a system. We talked about engineering and systems design. What is a system? Well, a system has to do several things. First of all, it has to have sensors. It has to know that something is needed. It has to have some kind of way to know that the salinity is wrong or the number of red blood cells is wrong. It then has to have an integrator which analyzes the sensory information that comes from the sensor. It has to make decisions about what the required action is and send those actions as a command to what they call an effector. And this is how systems engineers think about it. The effector receives signals from the integrator and takes the required action. So basically, it's then a feedback loop. So you sense something's wrong, you tell somebody you got to do something about it, they do something about it, and then you evaluate their work. There's going to be a check. There's going to be a test on this. You're going to be graded on this test. And if you don't produce the right amount, we'll say, no, produce more, or wait, you're producing too much, slow down, or stop. The sensor is part of this feedback loop that is kind of a continuous cycle where the amount of action that's being taken by this process has to be regulated. This is not trivial. So again, thinking about this just a little deeper, so you have to figure out what's wrong in a system that can be fixed. So sensing something's wrong in a system you can't fix doesn't do any good. So you have to have systems that can sense problems, all kinds of problems, and fix a particular one that will solve the problem. So you have to be tuned to the problem in order to have a fix. The integrator has to determine what action is going to be taken and how it's supposed to be put in place. The effector is going to receive those signals and take the required action. And again, it's a feedback loop that's going continually. But when we have the body, here are 11 different systems, all of which have to be functioning, and each of them have subsystems. So you have systems of systems. If any one of these 11 systems is malfunctioning, guess what you end up with? A non-functioning body. That's called dead. So all of these have to be working together, and all of them are systems of systems that do things. Incredibly complex. So, again, if we want to fix the problem, we have to interact with other systems, figure out how to do it. And so I'm going to show you a schematic. This is one problem, just one problem. And here's the problem. Every cell requires oxygen for respiration. Fairly simple, right? You have something on the order of trillions of cells. Each of those has to have oxygen or the cell dies. The capillary system and the circulatory system are so sophisticated that they get blood to every cell. Otherwise, it would die, right? So here's the problem. So how do we solve it? Well, first of all, we have to figure out what the problems are that we have to solve to do the solution we want. And so we have a problem, and I'm not going to go into the details here because every time you add a set of possible things that might solve it, you end up with other problems to solve. And so this is just one problem of how do we get cells oxygen that they need. And every time you expand into another level of solution, there are some other things that have to be solved, and it gets more and more complex the deeper you go. And this, again, is one system of one part of the respiratory system, and it could go on and on. This has to integrate with other systems, like the circulatory system. So you get oxygen around, but then you've got to get nutrients around. You've got to balance it. You can't have too much. So you've got all these sensors and effectors that are going. And this, again, just one subsystem of a subsystem. So the design argument is a pretty compelling case. When you have these finely tuned systems, how would they all arise at once so that you have a functioning body? It seems like it was designed for a purpose to start with. So let's look at optimal design. Once you have the idea of a design in place, how do we optimize it? Well, this idea of biomimetics is where we take biological design and we mimic it in our human designs. A man named Stuart Burgess, he's an engineer who unfortunately has been very effective at getting the British cycling organization to the gold medal Olympics platform multiple Olympics in a row, partly because of his incredible designs for engineering the bicycles that they use. So he's taken some of his designs and used them against the United States, but we'll give him a pass on that. So this is a little bit of an AI voice, so get past that, but and it's just a brief outtake. I'll give you a QR code that'll let you look at the 20-minute video. This is going to be about a 2-minute outtake.
As researchers probe deeper into nature's complex biological systems, observations are being cataloged that showcase a plethora of exquisite engineering design solutions. These design solutions routinely display staggering levels of complexity and elegance. One academic who is questioning Darwin's evolutionary paradigm is Dr. Stuart Burgess, a researcher in bioengineering. Dr. Burgess has run scientific laboratories at world-leading universities including Cambridge University and Bristol University in the UK. He has also been an editor of scientific research journals in bioengineering including the Journal of Biomimetics. Dr. Burgess has spent 40 years carrying out research in the area of robotic joints including bio-inspired joints. His work has helped produce record-breaking robotic arms for spacecraft such as the METOP meteorological series of satellites deployed by the European Space Agency. The knee joint has a very large range of flexion of typically 150 degrees.
This is made possible by an ingenious design feature of a 4-bar linkage mechanism.
This linkage mechanism contains 2 crossed links formed by the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments. The other 2 links are effectively formed by the femur and tibia bones.
This 4-bar mechanism forms a special type of hinge with a moving center of rotation.
This enables the tibia to roll around the femur bone with a large flexion range.
The 4-bar mechanism also keeps the quadricep muscles at the optimal position for maximizing their force.
The complex linkage mechanism of the knee joint provides compelling evidence of purpose-driven design. It is well known in engineering that linkage mechanisms like car steering systems and car suspension systems require meticulous planning and design.
So that's just an example of some of the systems engineering arguments in practice. There's a QR code on your page, on your notes on the back side to get to the full video. So I won't leave this up here for long. In fact, it's going to be going away very quickly, but it's on your page, so you can look at it later. So again, I'm going to look at a real simple example. We'll kind of dumb it back down again. I'm kind of a simple guy, so I retired from over 50 years of flying airplanes. So here's an airplane, okay? So if we want an optimal design, let's just think through this one more time. So here's an airplane that is functional. We'll just say, make believe this cartoon airplane is functional. But an airplane is a set of compromises that engineers have to wrestle with. So if we want to do something to modify it, we could move the wings back, and that would actually make it more nimble and more responsive. But at the same time, it would be less stable, so you'd have more likelihood of accidents. So that could be kind of a problem. So you want it more responsive, but you don't want it to be you can't control it. If you move it farther forward, now you're going to have too much pressure on the tailplane, so you've got a more stable airplane, but that's not going to work very well either. So you move back to the middle. But you want it to go faster, so you put smaller wings on it. There's less drag, but then you have to take off and land faster, and so you have a lower safety margin. And so you want a better safety margin, you put huge wings on it, but now it's going to have more drag and it won't be able to go as fast. And so there's this set of compromises. You want it to have a lot of power, but if you have engines too big, it's going to use a whole lot of gas and it won't be very fuel efficient. You can't go very far. So you have this, oh, by the way, you need a lot longer landing gear for these bigger engines. That's what got the 737 in trouble, why they can't expand it any further, because, anyway, that's a different topic. So you want, again, you're always balancing these constraints so that you have the optimal design. And so when people complain about this or that joint, for example, the wrist was criticized by evolutionists as a terrible design. But Burgess has shown that it's an optimized design to do all the things that are required of it, to be resilient, to be flexible, to be strong. And so he's shown optimal design to be what the creator has probably used as well. So that's the optimal design argument. Finally, we're going to look at astronomy briefly. This is one of my favorites. I really have enjoyed looking at astronomy as mostly as a historian of astronomy, but doing some observation with a telescope as well. It's kind of fun. When you look at the solar system, you have this incredibly well-balanced, machine-like structure of planets, of stars, well, in the solar system, just one star, obviously, but it's the right size, and that's a good thing. It's not too hot, not too cold. The planets seem to be arranged in such a way that we have protection from floating space debris. The larger planets, Saturn, Uranus, and Jupiter, absorb a lot of the stuff that would be floating around and might be dangerous to us. So the asteroid belt also acts as kind of a filter for some of this space debris. Lots of ways in which that works. But how does the solar system work? Well, it turns out in the 1600s, a guy named Kepler came up with the laws of planetary motion. He did this in 1609. And we're going to go through these very, very briefly, just to give you an idea. He did this without a calculator, without a computer, without even a slide rule. He did it with math on a piece of paper. Anyway, so the first of the things he discovered is that the actual shape of the orbits of different things that are floating based on gravitational forces are conic sections. So if you cut a cone with a plane, you get either a parabola or you get an ellipse. And it turns out in a closed orbit where it comes back to its starting point, all of those orbits are ellipses, they're not circles. Again, he figured this out with math. He also said, he said the orbit of each planet is an ellipse with the sun at one of the focal points. He also discovered that the line joining the planet to the sun sweeps out equal areas in equal time. So he's doing the area inside an ellipse at equal times, and of course as the elliptical orbit is closer to the object, it's going faster. As it's farther away, it's going slower. Then it kind of speeds up as it goes downhill, if you will, back to the starting point. But in equal time periods, the area swept is exactly the same. Brilliant. I don't know how he figured that out, but he did. And then this one's harder to explain. We'll go through it. The period of the planet is proportional to the cube of its mean distance from the sun. So what this means is, if you have a typical sun, that's our sun, and this is a typical planet, we'll call it Earth, and the planet is going around the sun, the distance is the diameter of the orbit, and the period is the time it takes for that orbit to happen. So the square of the period is proportional to the cube of the distance. Think about this. He figured this all out by watching planetary motions and charting them and doing math to figure out what they were doing. Anyway, these are the laws of planetary motion. I don't expect you to be able to regurgitate those. They'll be in your notes later. And then taking these and the law of gravitation, Newton derived laws of motion. So he and Kepler were similar time periods. And here's what Newton said about what he saw in the solar system. He said, though these bodies may indeed persevere in their orbits by mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have at first derived the regular position of the orbits themselves from those laws. Thus, he said, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So as Newton is looking at what this mechanism does, he sees the hand of God designing some incredible balanced force, a set of forces that cannot be explained by gravity itself. So gravity describes how they behave, but not how they started to behave in that way. So he was convinced that that was the case. The presentation we did on astronomy is available with this QR code, along with some of the other presentations on the design. So that's the basic argument from design. We've managed to cover that in just under an hour, which is, I was a little concerned about that. But we did that. So here's the basic outline. And again, as I said, we did a 6-part series on this in the spring of this year, and the QR code on your page is available to look at any of those about which you may be curious. And so with that, we'll go back to our muscle man, and he's going to remind us that the only bad questions are the ones that are never asked. So feel free to ask questions at this point. I'll have a couple of real quick announcements, but who's got questions at this point on the design stuff or anything else we've talked about? We would like you at this point to pull out your phone, and the last QR code on your page and up here is a request for feedback. So if you wouldn't mind, before you leave, it's only 4 questions. If you would do this brief survey, it'll help us to refine our presentation stuff that we're trying to do here to help people understand about the design world and other topics. So we have, I'll leave this, I'll come back to this, but I do want to mention that in November, we're doing a first Sunday of each month presentation, and the age of the universe controversy will be our subject in November. So we'll have a number of us giving different aspects of the argument for the age of the universe. Is it old? Is it young? Can it be known? How do we know if it can be known? So we'll talk about that in November. First Sunday is going to be November 2nd, and we'll hope to see you all back here. Bring your friends, and we'll have a rousing discussion about how old is this place anyway. So that should be fun. And we have people in the church here who are on different sides of that issue, and that's okay. We would never separate fellowship with anybody who disagrees with us on an area about which there is some ambiguity, and that's okay. So here's the QR code again if you're still looking for that for the feedback, and I will certainly, again, be here if you have any questions, but if not, thank you very much for your time. God bless you, and please be convinced that God designed everything, because He did. Okay, thanks.